Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world and joining us today. A very warm welcome indeed to Brussels and to this afternoon in Central Europe's Solutions Week workshop and seminar on developing and scaling regenerative agriculture. Part, of course, as you saw in the opening video, part of the forum's Month of March program, and delighted to be hosting this in collaboration with the European Landowners Organization. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Mark Titterington. I'm a co-founder and senior advisor to the Forum for the Future of Agriculture. But most importantly, this afternoon, it's my job to keep us on track and to moderate what I have no doubt is going to be a very energetic and insightful discussion. We are, of course, focusing on this topic of regenerative agriculture. It's part of our debate and our theme of the month of March, striving for striving with the transformation of the food system towards a more resilient and sustainable and climate-ready agriculture. As you all know, for many people, regenerative agriculture has the potential to play a critical role in this journey towards a more sustainable agriculture system. And there has certainly been some momentum building behind this, both in Europe and indeed around the world over the past couple of years. But if this approach is to become one of the predominant, even dominant agriculture system approaches in the world, I think we can probably safely assume that there will be some fundamental changes and some fundamental questions that need to be addressed. These include, but are not necessarily limited to, finding a way toward a commonly accepted definition of what regenerative agriculture is, how we build awareness and understanding across the agri-food system, and indeed industry for all stakeholders in what that looks like. How we support growers and land managers and meet their need, how to support them in making and sustaining a transition to a regenerative agriculture system. And perhaps particularly, what can downstream and upstream actors in the value chain play in supporting this? And of course, underpinning all of that, what role should policy, regulation and legislation play in enabling regenerative agriculture and ensuring that we measure and record the results and outcomes and impact and benefits as accurately as possible? These are just some of the questions I think we're going to get into today with what will be hopefully a very discursive and energetic panel session. Now, we do want your input as well as the audience for this event, and you're going to have a number of opportunities to register your thoughts and opinions as we go through this afternoon. There's at least 4 or 5 live polls that will be taking place during the discussion, and I'd also encourage you to use the Q&A function to put forward any questions that you might have. When you do so, please may I ask you to indicate who you are and where you are from. Any questions that we don't manage to get to today, we will of course try to follow up. Well, in our live studio this afternoon, I'm delighted to welcome a high quality range of expert stakeholders who are going to help us to answer some of the questions that we've got during this afternoon's session. At the core of this are the farmers, often surprisingly, I find lost sometimes in this debate, or not at the center of it. And so I'm delighted to welcome back to the forum Galina Pisheva, one of Bulgaria's, indeed Europe's most innovative and certainly inspiring land managers. She's someone that's managed the farming business in Bulgaria since 2007, and she's developing it towards a more sustainable, regenerative future. From the United States, Shari Roger-Fidler, good friend, president and CEO of the Farm Foundation, a 5th generation farm owner and operator herself. I think fair to say also, Shari, an entrepreneur in your own right in the organic and branded food industry. Lots of leadership roles, including as a leader of one of the important soil health technology firms. Closer to home, and here in Europe, we have Mark Rossier, more than 25 years experience in agri-food companies, and is today, in addition to his other roles, the senior advisor to the European Landowners European Policy Group, where he has specific responsibility for the carbon farming dossier. Further out into the value chain, we're joined by Fabio Brusas, Senior European Affairs Manager at Nestlé. He holds a specialized master's from the French National School of Administration, where he undertook research on regenerative agriculture and its carbon sequestration potential in soils. He's also chair of the Agriculture Policy Group at Food and Drink Europe. From a research perspective, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Alexandra Nepomuceno, General Head of the National Soybean Research Center at Embrapa, which you will know is a Brazilian Agriculture Research Corporation. Embrapa, long-standing contributors over the years to the forum, and nice to have you with us, Alexander, this afternoon or this morning for your time. And finally, Emmanuel Patel, Policy Coordinator at DG Agri in the European Commission, where he has been responsible for the discussion and the dialogue on the future of the Common Agriculture Policy, particularly with respect to the greening architecture. Our panelists are all very welcome indeed. But we're going to start by setting the scene, and it's hard to imagine anyone better to do this than our opening speaker today, very experienced addition to our panel of experts contributing to this dialogue. It is an honor and a pleasure to introduce to you again and welcome back to the forum Herbert Dorfmann. He needs very little introduction from me. You'll know he's a hugely experienced elected member of the European Parliament for the Südtirol Alto Adige in northern Italy, one of my favorite parts of the world. But he brings enormous experience in agriculture and, not surprisingly, is a key contributor to the Parliament's Agriculture Committee. So without further ado, welcome back again, Herbert. Let me stop talking and let's listen to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thanks for this invitation. Yes, just some thoughts at the beginning of this very interesting afternoon here. If we speak about regenerative agriculture, very often, it is about soil fundamentally. And I personally think in agriculture, quality of soil and availability of soils is very often heavily underestimated, because we do not see very often that soils are a result of a long evolution. And these soils can be very easily destroyed. And therefore, I think the protection and improvement of soil is of key importance if we want to assure food security in Europe and globally. Just today, some hours ago, we voted here in the European Parliament a resolution trying to find an answer on possible food shortage, which could be the result of the war in Ukraine. And I personally have the impression here in the European Parliament, since this terrible war in Ukraine started, the question of food security is again in the debate. In the agriculture debate and debate about the future of agriculture, we very often forgot, I personally think in the last years, the importance of food security. So the importance to combine sustainability with productivity. And I think this is one of the key factors of this afternoon, because if we want to speak about regenerative agriculture, it is about how to protect soils and keep them at the same time producing. Let me just remind 2 or 3 things, then I come to, let's say, regenerative agriculture. I personally think we need to protect soils better, especially also from urbanization, which this is a highly underestimated topic. If cities grow, if we build new streets, new infrastructure, whatever, we very often forget that we are destroying a lot of soil all over the world, but especially in Europe and especially in the highly, let's say, developed parts of Europe. And destroying these soils is incredible easy, but re-establish them is incredible difficult. Then we need to understand the reasons for degradation, and the reasons are a lot. We have for sure climate change, more and more erosion, we have overuse. And I think we very often concentrate also or mainly on arable land. But it is not only a question of arable land. We need to see agriculture as a whole. I remember, for example, vineyards. Till some years ago, it was normal, and vineyards normally are on the hills. So erosion is very, very easy on vineyards. Till some years ago, for example, the whole Champagne was, in the whole Champagne area, they used glyphosate, and it was fundamentally soil exposed to erosion. Now, if you go to Champagne and a lot of other vineyards in Europe, you see them green. And it works. It works better than before with a very, very easy method, greening these vineyards and keeping them away from erosion, which we had before. But said this, I personally think we have an approach also here in politics in Brussels to distinguish more and more to say we need land for biodiversity purposes. For now, for example, we have this debate. We also, this morning, we had a very hard debate about the famous nature restoration law and the idea to reserve 10% of the land for biodiversity. And I have the impression more and more we have this approach to say we decide on a percentage, and we decide that some part of the soil of the land is dedicated to biodiversity and the other is not. And this, I think, is the highly wrong approach. We need to combine biodiversity with use. And I think simply to say, and they do not say that the 10% would not maybe also give sense, but we should keep in mind that you have also, if you have 10% dedicated to biodiversity, you still have 90%. And this maybe is more important to look what happens on the 90% and how you can improve biodiversity, soil quality on the 90%. And this idea to distinguish between surface dedicated to nature and surface fields dedicated to agriculture is mostly an American approach, where the Americans for decades, they installed nature restoration areas, big resource dedicated to nature and others for agriculture. But I think we need to do everything in order to combine the two things. Two important notions, and I close. I think if it comes to regenerative agriculture, we need to re-establish fertilizer cycles in Europe. We have, unfortunately, more and more concentration of animals in Europe in some parts, in some regions of this continent. This means that in this continent, we have too much nutrients, especially too much nitrogen in the soil, which contributes to the degradation of this soil. And in other parts where we have loose animals, we need non-organic fertilizers, mineral fertilizers, or we do not have them. And we need to have a look how to reestablish this situation, how to come out of this situation, maybe having a better distribution of animals, but also using new technologies to transform manure in organic fertilizers and trying to distribute, trying to come into a real cycle of fertilizers. And then, and this I think will be an important topic today, for sure, we have on the table the idea of carbon farming. And I personally very much support this idea. I think carbon farming could be an incentive for the farmers, and give them a double advantage. On one side, it helps them to improve their soils, so improving yields, improving resilience of the soils. And on the other side, it gains a new form of income. And I think it would be also important to introduce this concept of carbon farming, because it would demonstrate to the public that agriculture can give an important contribution to climate change. So I'm very much in favor of the proposal from the Commission side, and I would like to support this also here in the Parliament to have a European, let's say, European rules about carbon farming, which are heavily needed because we have, as you know, a series of experiences now on experimental scale in Europe, but we need to come to a European approach. And then last point, I think we need to re-underline the importance of permanent grassland. Permanent grassland is extremely important for the quality of soils in Europe and in the world. They are important to feed animals. And I think we need to come a bit out from this idea to say, we save this planet with a vegetarian nutrition. No, I'm aware that maybe we eat too much meat and milk and dairy products. But if we want to use permanent grassland in Europe, we need animals, because only animals can transform grass into high value proteins. And I think we need to come down on our imports of proteins and animal feed. And we see in this moment how dependent we are also from a nation like Ukraine. And we need to come back to feed our animals also with or more than we do it now with permanent grassland. I think this would, with this, the European agriculture would become more resilient and more sustainable, and we would close also here fertilizer cycles in Europe. Thank you very much.
Herbert, thank you very much indeed. The way you covered the waterfront there and contextualized our debate was excellent. Just one quick follow-up question, if I may, to you. Some people argue that regenerative agriculture can help to make that balance between food security and environmental or social sustainability as well. How confident are you, given the geopolitical challenges that we're now facing, the conflict in the East, that the European Union will be able to maintain that balance for food security whilst also advancing the sustainability agenda?
I personally think that what happens, unfortunately, in Ukraine is a wake-up call, because we always said also in political circles that this year, the Common Agricultural Policy contributed to a highly autonomous food system in Europe. We are able to produce the food we need. But now with this situation in Ukraine, we see that this is not really true. We are highly dependent on some, let's say, on import of especially in feed. And therefore, I think we have to rethink our system, especially if it comes to the production of feed, of animal feed. I think I'm convinced we need to produce more animal feed in Europe, proteins, oil plants. This we have on this a high dependence, and we need also be aware that we cannot outsource CO2 emissions in agriculture to other parts of the world, because also this is a topic which is more and more on the agenda. We want to be the best in the world, but then at the end we outsource our emissions to other parts of the world, and I think this is highly unfair and for the safety of the planet for sure inappropriate.
Thank you, Herbert, and really appreciate that, and also thank you for staying with us as we go through our discussion this afternoon. Really pleased as well that you started with the importance of soil health, which of course for many it goes to the heart of what regenerative agriculture is. I want to now start to bring in other members of the panel, and I'm going to open the first topic, if you like, on what we define regenerative agriculture to be, what it is. As I've alluded to, and Herbert made clear in his opening comments, for some, soil health is at the absolute core of that. So, Marc Rossier, European Landowners Organization, as well as your various other roles, how do you define regenerative agriculture?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me in this webinar. When we think about regenerative agriculture, we know that it's based on agroecology, and agroecology stands for sustainable use of local resources, local farmers' knowledge and expertise, also wise use of biodiversity to provide ecosystem services and resilience. But regenerative agriculture then itself is centered on soil. It takes out some elements of this agroecology movement and science. It's centered on soil, and it seeks to enhance and sustain the health of soil by restoring organic matter, by boosting fertility and productivity. And its primary focus is on soil health, like you said, with the underlying theory that, in fact, the world cannot be fed unless the soil is fed. So it focuses on five main measures, let's say: reduce chemicals, less tillage, 365 days of cover, smart diversification in the rotation, and restore circularity, what Herbert was telling, closing the organic fertilizer cycles again. That's, in our opinion, what's regenerative agriculture about.
Mark, thank you for that. As you've kind of touched on there, there's conservation, there's regeneration, there's enhancement. That's a perspective from Europe. Let me now bring in our guests from North America and from Latin America. First to you, Shari, Chief Executive of the Farm Foundation in the United States. What's your definition of regenerative agriculture, and how close would that be to what you just heard from Mark?
Great, thanks, Mark, and thanks for the invitation to be here with all of these wonderful speakers. I do feel the burden of representing all of the United States, and I will say that I do wear two hats, one as a farmer myself, and that one's the easier hat to wear, and I feel comfortable speaking about that, but I will also try my best to speak on behalf of Farm Foundation and the approach in the US. And certainly for definitions, I think we all agree there are no clear definitions. I think the use of the word is really trending in corporate America and in the USDA, but I think there's a big gap between that and the farm level. I think broadly speaking, there are two approaches to definitions. One I'd say is a philosophy approach, and the other is a practices approach. On the philosophy approach, I think it's really focusing on a different goal in terms of the philosophy, not just yield, but a systems approach or an integrated approach to farming, with the goal being broader of managing ecosystem benefits, including soil health. And I'd say a parallel in the business world, I'm a business person as well, might be that how companies don't just focus on profitability. Some companies don't just focus on profitability and only on shareholders, but companies such as Nestle, for example, with us today, take a broader view about creating value for all stakeholders. So I see that kind of philosophy as a parallel there. On the practices side of thing, I think Mark just did a great job highlighting those practices. I think those are the primary practices that I would have highlighted too. From a farm perspective myself, I think the biggest challenge out of that is the integration of animals into our system and the access to organic fertilizer. We have really struggled with that. And to just punctuate this gap at the farm level, I would say amongst farmers, I'd say there's a wide-ranging view about regenerative ag and even a wide-ranging awareness about regenerative ag. In the US, we talk about the coffee shop talk. So the farmers convening in the coffee shop to talk. And I would say in our local coffee shop and in our county, it's probably rarely uttered. The word regenerative ag is very rarely discussed or talked about in our county. I'm in the Corn Belt of the United States. So I think that's something that we have to address, is the gap between sort of corporate and policy level and the farm level, certainly in the US. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah. Shari, thank you for that. But just before I go to Alexander, and Brapra, I just want to bring Galina in very quickly from Bulgaria. Galina, I've got a specific question for you later, but do you discuss the term regenerative agriculture on your farm or in your community of farmers? You know, Shari there said it's rarely discussed in the coffee shop that she's in the Corn Belt in the US. In Bulgaria, is the term understood?
Absolutely. I think in Bulgaria, we started doing regenerative agriculture probably 10 years ago. And actually, the way I learned about this set of practices was through the informal farming community that I belong to. So it was not called regenerative agriculture. It was more like what do we do to have more fertile soil? How do we protect our soil? How do we fight erosion? How do we reduce the amount of glyphosate and the amount of fertilizer we use? And I strongly believe that it's peer-to-peer, very informal approach. And we didn't know the official term for it. It was long before it became a buzzword that we started trying things. A lot of things were not good ideas. For example, once we brought in a speaker, a professor from Brazil, to talk to us about cover crops. And he shared a lot of great ideas, and we were very enthusiastic. We bought all of those seeds, and it was a massive failure because they didn't work for our climate or for our soils. They didn't sprout. But in any case, it is, I don't think it's considered even innovation anymore, because everyone I know is doing some sort of combination between the practices that are generally considered part of regenerative agriculture. So this is maybe one big difference between the US and Europe. I think here it's not uncommon to have it on even small and mid-sized farms.
Thank you, Galina. So I'm going to go to Alexander in Brazil at Embrapa. I'm asking you the same question. How do you define regenerative agriculture? I've been struck already by the comments of the previous speakers. I mean, the practices themselves are not necessarily rocket science, if I can say that, but we are starting to look at how they might fit into a systems wide transformation that I think Shari was talking about. So, Alexander, what's your perspective on how we define regenerative agriculture, certainly from Brazil?
First of all, Mark, thank you very much for the opportunity. Like Shari, it's an honor to be here and trying to represent South America, specifically Brazil. And I'm going to give you a few examples of what we're doing here in Brazil. But I think Herbert defined very well in terms of what would be regenerative agriculture. But it's the kind of agriculture where we preserve soil, but not only soil, we preserve water. We are talking a lot about carbon footprint, but pretty soon we are already talking about water footprints. Water will be a problem in a few years. It's already in the world. For example, in this season in Brazil, only in the soybean, we lost 10% of our production because of a big drought in the south of Brazil and Argentina. So we need to have systems, sustainable systems, and then there is an overlap between the concept of regenerative agriculture and sustainability. Then we can, where you try to preserve all those components. We try to reduce or even eliminate the use of chemical pesticides. We have many new solutions for that. We live in the world a few revolutions today. The digital one, everybody knows, the blockchain, the images, the applicatives, everything that helps the producer in this decision making. But we also have a revolution in genetics. For example, technologies like the use of RNA interference as a topical application can substitute pretty soon insecticides, insecticides, fungicides, herbicides. So those are technologies that you need to use when you go to the concept of regenerative agriculture. It's like I said, an overlap with sustainable agriculture. Use of biodiversity. Probably Brazil have around 20 to 30% of the biodiversity of our planet. And we are exploring that. We are using some of those microorganisms, some of these organisms in agriculture to reduce emissions footprint, carbon emission footprints, and to increase, for example, absorption of phosphorus. I can give you later a few examples during my talk. In Brazil and South America, we have the privilege of have 365 days that we can have a soil covered by plants. So you can get the CO2 from the atmosphere, use the photosynthesis, incorporate this carbon in the soil, and use systems like no-tillage and others that I can talk later. This is, for me, regenerative agriculture. We have the necessity of production food for the planet. And when you talk about sustainability or regenerative agriculture, we must keep in mind it must be sustainable socially and environmentally, but also must be economically sustainable. Otherwise, it will not work. So those are three axes that we must keep in mind when you talk about sustainability or regenerative agriculture.
Well, thank you for that, Alexander. There's plenty of opportunity for us to come back on a lot of what you've said. I want to go to the poll now. We've heard from Herbert and our distinguished panelists on what they think regenerative agriculture is. So, if my technical team can bring up the poll, we'd like to see whether or not you, as the audience, are convinced. So, the statement is regenerative agriculture can enable the food and agriculture system to be more resilient and sustainable. You can see the choices on the screen. Can I ask you to make yours now? Very good. I'm sure you've all contributed there, and there's the results. Strong agreement to agreement, and no disagreement. So you're all convinced by what our panelists have said. We're off to a very good start. Let's get into some of the detail behind this now. Then, so Sherry, I'm going to come back to you. You talked about the coffee shop in the Corn Belt in the US. You said that farmers were perhaps there not talking about regenerative agriculture, even if they were doing the practices, something your fellow panelists have indicated as well. From your perspective, how do we then build awareness and buy-in across the agri-food system, across stakeholders, as to what regenerative agriculture is and why it can deliver benefits? How do we go about doing that? How are you looking at this?
Great, thank you. And I already felt like I might have misrepresented all the coffee shops across the US when I talked about mine. And so I do want to go back and say we are talking about soil health and tillage and cover crops, and even where to access manure in our coffee shop, not the manure in our coffee shop, but where to access manure. So we are discussing the practices, but we're just not talking about it as regenerative ag. And I guess it begs the question of, does that matter or not? And I think that is an important issue to be discussed, possibly at the policy level. And is there ever going to be a certification process for it or not? Because that's when it would matter. But otherwise, I would say it doesn't matter because we're all working towards the same outcomes then. I think I was going to share more about the buy-in side of things, because I think that's actually a really complex challenge to tackle, even if you get to the awareness stage, to get the buy-in, because of the complexity of managing all 5 of these practices and how different it is from region to region, farm to farm, and the different cropping systems in the US and across Europe. And I was just in a conversation this week about that. And again, I'll go back to the gap of whether it's the ESG investor community or the policy level and then the farm level, of really truly understanding the challenges at the farm level for integrating these practices. For example, it might mean new equipment and different equipment that the farmers might need to use. It probably means having access to an advisor who can really help navigate those change in practices. And the access to the manure. I mean, just thinking about in my lifetime, I grew up with animals in our operation, but with the specialization across the US with animal production, it's like hundreds of miles before we can see the next animal from our farm. And so the cost of accessing manure or integrating animals into our operation, and that's similar across the US, is a real complexity. So even if we get to awareness, the buy-in of the practices and the adoption of those practices is a great challenge. Taking cover crops, for example, I've been working both professionally and personally at trying to advance cover crops, and we're still less than 5% adoption in the US, across the US. And it really is because of that complexity of how to integrate it in the different cropping systems and the different weather patterns in the US. So I'm afraid I don't have like a silver bullet or any solution for this, but I think nonetheless, we need to keep working together towards that. And I think farmers are aligned in working towards the outcomes, even if we don't call it regenerative ag.
Well, I appreciate that perspective, Shari. And in a moment, I might just go to possibly Emmanuel Pele at DG Agri to ask that question, whether or not it matters whether or not we call it regenerative agriculture, whether the practices, if they're being done, that's the most important. But just before I do that, I want to bring Fabio Brusa in from Nestle. Fabio, I mean, your company has made a significant commitment to source from regenerative agriculture. I think you're quite specific about that, quite explicit. You know, what from your point of view do you think needs to be done in terms of building the buy-in across the agri-food system? Because you're just one part of it, and sometimes you will be sourcing your ingredients from fields that are producing more than the crops that you would want. So how do we get that buy-in across it, and how do you deliver your program and commitments?
Yeah, thank you, Mark, for inviting for this question. Very interesting. As you said, Nestle is committed in regenerative agriculture because we are committed to source from this kind of production 20% of our raw materials in the 2025 and then more in the coming years. So the question is how to put at scale regenerative agriculture. So the answer to us is very simple and sometimes complex, is to put the farming community at the center. And when we do that, we have 3 areas of need to help that we have identified. The first one is the risking of the transition to make it more attractive, which means that we have to help farmers by training, offering technical assistance, training, investment, and paying premiums when we deal with them. For instance, Nestle put more than 1 billion euros investment with the regenerative agriculture. The second area we can consider is to increase the collaboration at the supply chain level. For now, you know, we are much more focused on our own supply chains, but we have experiences in some countries, in France and in Poland, UK, that we have to keep a landscape project approach, which means that we have to define collectively what is the role of agriculture in a certain territory, and we have to act as several companies with public authorities and NGOs in a territory to help farmers to grow in regenerative agriculture, and in a certain way to reward them not only for buying raw materials but also for other ecosystem services they produce. And the third areas we consider very important is to advocate for a favorable policy frameworks. We know that regenerative agriculture is something sometimes new, sometimes known, but we need to focus on the outcome KPIs that we have to follow. So put in place standards to monitoring, reporting, and verify these KPIs, because they have to be in a certain consistency. And then we have to also advocate for much more public funding on these practices. In particular, European Union could help farmers to direct the right funding to regenerative agriculture. There is, eco schemes. It's a good start, but we go farther if we can put much more focus on that. So this is the 3 areas we identify to scale up the regenerative agriculture.
Fabio, thank you for that. I'm encouraged by the references that you talked about supply chain collaboration and trying to work at a landscape level. I do worry in this area that farmers might experience competing demands from the downstream chain in terms of what's needed. And I'm encouraged by what you described there about collaboration and working at the landscape level. Emmanuel Patel, at DG Agri, just to go back to that question that Shari posed, does it matter whether or not we, from a policy perspective, give something a label like regenerative agriculture, or is it the practices that are more important? What would be your perspective on that, Emmanuel?
I don't know, because I will react on what some correspondents explain, and there is a gap between some I would say, technology or some innovation and develop it by some research and farmer. And we as regard the regenerative agriculture and the carbon farming, we want to fit this gap, and we will develop some means to do that. After we will, in a carbon farming, we will go in direction of certification scheme. That means is a way to have a recognition of these practices. It's not only regenerative agriculture, but regenerative agriculture with part of some practices what we have already identified. And we are planning to have a more certification scheme, and to have a credit carbon behind that, and to in fact to have a rewarding of farmers for these practices. Is the way we are going today. If you want to have a labeling, I don't know, it's not completely labeling, but it will be a certificate at some stage in a direction of carbon sequestration. But it will include this, in fact, this regenerative agriculture approach, in fact.
So, well, thank you for that, Emmanuel. I don't want to overinterpret what either you or Fabio said, but there's something there around being clear about what it is in order to be able to create the value around it that someone will pay and ultimately incentivize the grower. That we're going to come to that question in a second, but just before we do, let's bring up the second poll. There was a great deal of consensus in the first one. I suspect we may have the same here. If the technical team can bring it up, we'd like to ask you for your view on whether developing and scaling regenerative agriculture can only be successful if the whole agri-food system is engaged and supportive. So off you go. I'll give you 20 seconds on this one. Okay, little bit more diverse, but nevertheless, a strong view that it does need the whole system to come together and engage and support this. So thank you for that. We'll be back with another one shortly. But you know, we were just talking in that last section about what growers do, how they might be rewarded, some of the things that DG Agri are beginning to put in place. I really do want to put the grower lens over this, grower land manager lens over this now. We are asking you growers and land managers to make and sustain a transition to these regenerative agriculture practices, carbon farming practices. What do you need? What kind of support do you need? And I'm going to go to Galina to start with. What support do you think growers and land managers need more than anything else to make and sustain the transition? Galina, your perspective would be gratefully received.
I want to be honest, and I admit that our regenerative practices system didn't become a success overnight. It took us almost 10 years of trial and error to gradually find out what works and what doesn't work on our farm. And this is very time-consuming and costly approach, and we made many mistakes along the way. I think, honestly, that first of all, we need peer-to-peer groups and farmer support, which will make most of us more confident in trying and introducing new practices into our farms, because I definitely agree with Alexander that we also have to be economically sustainable in order to be any other way, sustainable in any other way. So I think decision makers should consider establishing regenerative farming as a legitimate path towards a sustainable agricultural future. And I can vouch that farmers will need practical evidence that this will work, and until they have the courage to try it on a large scale. They will need models to see what it actually looks like in their own region. Only when they come and see that it works for their neighbor would they try it on their own. And we can do that practically by building resilient farms and communities and hosting programs, field days, doing on-farm research rooted in farmer questions, and building a peer-to-peer network. But we also will need definitely the support of the entire system in order to pay for this transition and in order to do this on a large scale. A lot of people have the romanticized idea of farming as a hobby, but in reality, we are already facing climate change. We are facing soil erosion, and I'm very, very impressed. I couldn't put it any better, but the notes that Herbert made at the beginning are absolutely on point. So it's very difficult to be a farmer, and to be a regenerative, innovative farmer takes courage and takes a lot of risk, which we already have enough of. So we need to get the support of society, of the Commission, by establishing criteria for what is regenerative farming and rewarding farmers who do the work and make the effort to become one.
Thank you for that, Galina. Can I just ask you very quickly, since you started to transition your farm in Bulgaria to a regenerative agriculture approach, using some of those practices, do you see an economic benefit already? I mean, you said it's taken you 10 years. Have you seen an economic benefit from what you've done?
Absolutely. Now I see it, and it's been a success ever since probably 4 or 5 years. But before that, like I said, we did a lot of unnecessary things. We did things that didn't work out right. And we had to find our way. And it takes 1 year for the new cycle, for the new harvest, until you see that, okay, this is not working, let's try something else. So it's not, okay, let's change it today because the crop is already there. So since it's a combination, for example, on my farm, we do minimum tillage, we do straw harrowing to reduce volunteers, we use various cover crops, we rotate up to 7 different crops on our fields. So it takes 7 years just to cycle through all the crops, and we use nitrogen and phosphorus fixing bacteria in our soil, which take a lot of time to start working. We actually saw that this is a practice very common in Brazil, and we take a lot of peer knowledge from Brazil, but not everything can be adapted. So you take a set of different things and you try them, and sometimes they work together, sometimes they don't. It takes time, and it doesn't happen overnight. It's not realistic to expect that by some year we'll have a magical transformation and everything will be fine.
Galina, thank you. I mean, that practical insight and making the transition and the trial and error that you're talking about is enormously valuable. I want to bring Herbert back in, if I may. I mean, your experience in agriculture is second to none, but also as an elected representative, a member of the Agriculture Committee in the Parliament yourself, you talk to a lot of farmers. What are they telling you that they need to adopt these practices, whether we call them regenerative agriculture or carbon farming or anything else? What do they need to make the transition and to sustain the transition?
Actually, Galina was very clear. She underlined how important it is to have also an economic sustainability on a farm beside the ecologic sustainability. And I think we as politicians and as lawmakers, we can try to contribute to this economic sustainability. I remember, for example, we have the eco schemes in the new common agricultural policy. The eco schemes will be 25% of the first pillar. And the first pillar in Europe is worth more or less 40 billion a year. So 25% is 10 billion a year. And it's up to the member states now in their strategic plans to decide how they spend this money. And I think it would be appropriate if we really believe in these things, it would be appropriate to support farmers who go this way, as Galina said before, and to support them and give them this economic sustainability which they need, because if they earn money, others will follow. I'm also convinced that we need to invest even more in research. We need knowledge, and knowledge comes from research, and we need to have a look how to get from the research to the farmer. So we need a better advisory system in Europe. This in some parts of Europe is really a problem. We need to become knowledge on the ground, and to have this, we need urgently to have young people. And with this, I don't want to say that not so young people are not open for innovation, but it is clear that young, trained people are very often very open-minded to these things, and we need to try to attract young people. And then, as I said before, I think this new approach of carbon farming could generate new resources, because these are resources coming from outside, from selling CO2 certificates to the outside world, to the emitters. And this means this is fresh money. It's not money coming from the common agricultural policy, but it's fresh money. And this could contribute and give us support to who is bearing this cost. And then I'm convinced not always regenerative agriculture and soil protection is necessarily creating higher costs. I made an example before about permanent crops, vineyards, and others. If you green these crops, this is not a cost. Very often you save money because you don't need to work on this field anymore. You simply need to cut the grass. So it's simply a change of behavior of how to deal in agriculture, but also this is very often connected with knowledge. And a bit the same, as Galina said before, is also with minimum tillage. There is for sure a transition cost. So if a farm goes from, let's say, conventional arable land to a minimum tillage, there is for sure a transition cost, because farmers need to learn this, and learning this, they may also lose some money. But at the end, if the system works, maybe the working this field is not more costly than doing it in a conventional way.
Herbert, thank you for that. There's a lot that you talked about there that we'll put into the poll in a second. I'm just also conscious of some questions that go in this direction that are coming through on the Q&A. I just want to go back to Alexander then from Brazil. Your perspective in Brazil and what Embrapa does. What are your growers and land managers in Brazil saying they need to support a transition? Sustaining a transition to these practices? Is it the same as what you're hearing in Europe?
Yes, Mark, it's the same, but we know that there is a lot of miscommunication, lack of information, we believe, because many of Brazilian producers use sustainable practices for carbon sequestration, water preservation. It's for example, we must create awareness that without the levels of grain production, soybean production, corn production that we have today, it will be impossible to have the quality food that you have, the high quality proteins that you have in the pork, in the egg, in the milk, the chicken. In terms of quality protein. So we must have these amounts of grain production. And in many places, like in Brazil, Argentina, United States, those systems are done in sustainable systems. We need to show into the two ends. We need to show to the ends of the stakeholders, the growers, but also the consumers. That we need to show that there are many practices, and I'm going to mention a few. For example, no tillage. In Brazil, we have 70% of our area using no tillage systems. Some done very, very well, others not so. But we have numbers from Embrapa, numbers from our researchers showing that we can sequestrate for hectare, for year, up to 3 tons of CO2 equivalent. So if you have a no-tillage system done very well, you can help. Agriculture is not developed, could be a very important tool for the climatic changes that we are seeing. Another example, nitrogen fixation. Last year, Brazil, this season actually, Brazil sold 40 million hectares of soybean. We use the nitrogen fixation in almost 100% of this area. Our numbers published in many high-impact journals around the world from our scientists can show if you did that very well, very well done nitrogen fixation, in like no-tillage system, we have producers that do very well and others not so. But let's say everybody did very well in the 40 million hectares. We didn't put in the atmosphere 200 million tons of CO2 equivalent that we are not using the atmosphere because you did not use chemical nitrogen, chemical fertilizers using nitrogen as a basis. As you know, the nitrous oxide emissions that come when you use a chemical fertilizer like urea is 300 times more polluting than CO2. So we need to show those producers and the society that those practices reduce emissions, make carbon sequestration, and most important, most of those practices do not reduce production. In the opposite, increase. Just don't get too long here, but I mentioned that this season here in the south of Brazil, I'm in the south in Paraná state, we lost in the soybean production 40%. In Rio Grande do Sul state, in the south border with Argentina, 50% of the soybean production. When you compare no-tillage, producers that use no-tillage system for 5 years, 6 years, and producers that use conventional agriculture, those that use no-tillage system that preserve more water, nutrients, make carbon sequestration, lost much less. So those are things that this kind of awareness, we need to show not only the producers to adopt those kinds of technologies, but also the society to understand the importance of these kind of systems to keep in prices that are affordable for everybody around the world.
So thank you for that, Alexander. Before I go to the poll on this one, I'm just going to merge it with another question that I was going to go to, and one that's come in, I think, let me make sure I pronounce it correctly, Theo Rulink. He asked a question about how do we gear up the kind of development of regenerative agriculture to grant farm income. I'm just going to go back to Fabio, and I may come Shari's way as well on this one. Fabio, I mean, what Alexander just described there is worth paying for. Apologies for the sharp question, but maybe not just from the Nestle perspective, but your peer group of companies, are you prepared to pay for this? Is the consumer prepared to pay for it?
Well, the consumer aspect is something we have to address at a certain time. What is sure that, and I was mentioning it before, it's part of our, in a certain way, commitment to help the transition to finance the de-risking phase, which is the startup phase, I would say. In the first years, we were referring to the startup phase of 3-5 years, where the farmers need to improve the techniques and then maybe have losses of production. So it's part of the role of us as a member of the food chain to help farmers to this transition, which means not necessarily to pay everything, to pay a part of the cost by training, helping with techniques, and also paying premium in the contracts. And I will refer afterwards to that. But yes, a part of the cost is now internalized in our buying, but it's not all the cost, because as a private sector we cannot afford everything.
If you want to elaborate on that, do so, because I'm not going to break this question up. So if you wanted to say more on what Nestlé is doing, please do so here.
Yeah, no, but very simply, we started the pilots a few years ago. Now these pilots are becoming something real. So there is I would say an objective to source from regenerative agriculture up to 20% of raw materials in 2025 and more in the coming years. And so we entering a contractualization phase with cooperatives of farmers, and in which we establish some KPIs that they have to follow. It's the outcome we were referring to in terms of regenerative agriculture, so CO2 sequestration, water retentions, healthy soils, and so on. And there is a production of raw materials, and this production has to be bought by Nestlé, but only not by Nestlé, because we are a lot of other companies, and the price and the contractualization, is part of the deal. So, and that means that we are paying part of the primes on that.
Okay,
that's and we signed the first regenerative agriculture supplying contracts in the Salon de l'Agriculture a few weeks ago. So that's concrete.
Okay, well, I'd like to spend more time getting into that. We're starting to run out of time, and I'm doing a terrible job as moderator and keeping us on time. We'll go straight to the poll on this one. I think the technical team can bring it up. You've got a couple of choices here. What do growers and land managers need as support? Be good to hear what the audience view is on that. You've got a couple of selections to make there, but you can only make one. So your 20 seconds starts now. Okay, there we go. We'll hold it there. Let's see what the view is. So financial support almost out in front. That's where I would have thought it would have gone, but it's the market for regeneratively growing crops. I guess those two things might go together, but the best practice and the knowledge sharing, going back particularly to what Galina was saying there, I think also very important. Okay, thank you for that. We'll move, I think, now into the last question or the last section of today's discussion. It does revolve around policy, legislation, and regulation. I'm going to just start by asking Emmanuel from DG Agri to just comment on what you think you've done as DG Agri, as the Commission, to enable some of these practices to be adopted, and then I'll bring in two of our colleagues to see whether or not it's working for them. So, Emmanuel, can I offer the floor to you on this one?
Yes. Anyway, Mr. Herbert Dorfman has already mentioned something. In fact, in new CEP, we adapt our tool, and we call that greening architecture. That means we have different elements in a way to foster and to promote some good practices. In fact, we admit to maybe some basic element. We call that conditionalities. I mean, we assume across of Europe, all farmers need to comply with some basic practices. And in this context, we underline the fact it's important to promote as much possible to extend the crop rotation concept at EU level, and to promote as well the minimum soil cover. We have two standards on that. Minimum soil cover. We insist because we are faced to member state administration and ministry, and they are reluctant to impose too much rule for farmer. But we insist on minimum soil cover as regards the soil protection for arable land during the winter, and we insist to extend this requirement for permanent crop, as it was mentioned for vineyard, for example. Vineyard is Donc we have this basic code, but above that, indeed, member state based on additional support. Now we have eco scheme, as it was mentioned by Mr. Herbert Dorfman, 25% of Pillar 1, and we have still room inside of Pillar 2 to have money to focus on some practices. And inside of that, member states have the freedom to set some intervention, but we have already identified some intervention, and there is a lot of things on soil cover again to have a mixture of seed or whatever, but the member state will promote that via eco scheme. There is a large, I would say, range of action, and sometimes there is some action from permanent grassland, but for arable land, there is action on via the soil cover again via eco scheme. In fact, we have this CAP, and in CAP we want to share as well as much possible knowledge with the farmer, and we are mentioning the fact we need to develop advisory system. I will take opportunity to say there is some research program, and inside of the research program, we have developed a mission on soil. And just to be clear on this mission on soil, we will develop a living lab concept. We will create 100 living lab. Inside of this living lab, it will be a good place to test and to demonstrate practices for carbon farming or for other practices, and to demonstrate that across various locations in Europe. I think it will reply to the expectation of the farmer to have some evidence from the ground, and via living lab, I think we will achieve something. As regards the carbon farming, but I said at the beginning, carbon farming can include regenerative agriculture. With a climate policy, we will set a climate pact social platform, and the idea behind is just to have some farmer group of farmer and land manager here to share their knowledge and to promote their knowledge. Like some ambassadors, and it's an idea as well. And I think we need to develop that, because I think it will go in the direction of what farmers expect. Beside of the CAP, there is another driver, I think, is climate policy. Because climate policy, will cover different sectors, but will include agricultural sectors. And it's important for me here to mention the target foreseen under the climate policy, because everybody has in mind there is an EU climate law adopted in last July 2021 to go further step in reduction of greenhouse gas emission, but to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. And by achieving this carbon neutrality, in fact, we need to have a huge contribution from land management for the agriculture, but as well for the forest as well. And it's important to underline that, because in fact, in relation with this law, we will have a specific monitoring in as regards the land use in member state. In LULUCF is some framework, and we want to have a target. We set a target, in fact, about 310 million tons of CO2 to be sequestered. That means to be absorbed by the land, and it's a huge target, and we will set this target between member states. But I think for us, we have to go in this direction, and after we will develop, as already said, carbon certification scheme as regards the carbon removal. And here we want to be. We are aware on the fact there is already, as it was mentioned by some speaker, some initiative at the local level and private initiative, and we will take on board that, and we have some consideration for that, but we want to develop an EU framework to offer some guarantee as regards the reporting and the verification of the carbon sequestration is an important element if we have to go in this direction and we want to develop this system at EU level and at large scale, I would say.
Super. Thank you, Emmanuel, for that. So Emmanuel has set out in great detail there, in a very concise way, what the policy landscape looks like around this. So I'm actually going to go back to Marc Rossier, and I'm going to put him on the spot, which is a little bit unfair because I hadn't warned him about this. Marc, are you convinced by the policy framework that is being put in place? You can say yes or no if you like. But just also stand back and tell us, in your view, how important a role policy and regulation will play in enabling this this system to be developed and scaled. Marc.
Thank you, Mark, for this interesting question. First of all, I think in the last poll there was said that a market for regenerative agriculture must be created. If you have to create a market for, want to create a market for reg ag, you need, of course, a regulatory environment. Otherwise, you don't, you have a wild market, but I think we all prefer an organized market. And there we need some regulations. There's a lot of work done by the European Commission, that's for sure. But there are still, I think, a number of elements that need some attention. First of all, I just cite a couple of them. First of all, when we look at the carbon farming communication on sustainable carbon cycles of December, we see, for instance, that the European Commission uses a very narrow definition of carbon farming. In that, it only takes into account removals, and everything that has to do with reductions is not accounted for. So that's an issue, because even in an arable land, when you start removing carbon, you also, our Brazilian colleague said it, you also have some emission effects, of course. So both are very important to take into account. Another element that probably is important to take into account is that the European Commission favors, and I do also, favors result-based systems. But result-based systems, at the moment in agriculture, we are applying measure-based systems almost all the time. So we need at least some transition period to go from the measure-based approaches towards the result-based approaches. And probably within a number of years, we need some hybrid systems to cover this transition. If you do not do this, all farmers, Galina can confirm, in Pillar 2, it's measure-based. It's not result-based. So that's the second point of attention. I think it's important to underline. A third element is that, and there I'm fully supporting the suggestion, the ideas of the European Commission. If we want to create impact by the farmers, impact that is impact on we produce outputs, agricultural products, but we also produce ecosystem services, and the carbon approach is a very interesting lever for the first time to get additional income across for the farmers who are producing, besides output, also ecosystem services. But there, of course, you need to verify and to measure concretely impact. Impact on biodiversity, impact on better water management, impact on carbon, and so on and so on and so on. And there, of course, we still lack a number of interesting or necessary instruments to do that. We have read in the different communication of the Commission that you are going to support and promote innovation in that area. But as long as this is not ready and available, of course, you can't measure the impact. And when the measurement impact can't be measured, you can't be rewarded. So all those elements are one part of a big puzzle. So I think everything is good. There's a lot of initiative, but there are still some concerns that have to be answered and filled out.
Marc, thank you. I mean, certainly the measurement piece and verification seems critical, I think, to building confidence and support of all stakeholders in the system. We are about out of time. I just do want to do the courtesy of inviting our guests from outside of Europe, maybe just with 1 minute, and it literally is 1 minute. If I could ask Alexander and Shari, just listening to this debate, one point that you'd want to stress as a takeaway, an insight, or something that you feel needs to be made as we close the discussion. Maybe I'll come to you, Shari, for a closing word.
Sure. I would close by saying I'm optimistic about the changes and the transformation in supply chains through companies like Nestle and others, General Mills, Anheuser-Busch, et cetera. I think I'm less optimistic about system-wide scale of change. And I think in order for that to happen, it's going to have to include private sector, government policy, and NGOs like Farm Foundation. We're an accelerator of practical solutions, and we're trying to see how we can help shrink that time that Galina mentioned of 10 years to 5 or 3 years through connecting farmers to the financial incentives and connecting farmers to the evidence that they need and the know-how.
Shari, thank you so much indeed. Alexander, it falls to you to bring us home. Your key insight, takeaway, point you'd like to stress from Embrapa and from Brazil.
Government policies are key tools to help in these strategies of sustainable agriculture. In Brazil, we have agroecological, organic, and conventional agriculture, and all are engaging in policies from our government. For example, the ABC program is low carbon agriculture. Other programs like I mentioned many examples of techniques that can help in reduce emissions. And then we have this, I can send you later. You have this, for example, low carbon soybean program from Embrapa. I can send you the link for the document where you try to have parameters, science-based, that can be used to certificate producers that use the best practices. And I think it's important to mention, because there is also lots of criticism about tropical agriculture. And in Brazil, probably many people don't know that we have one of the toughest environmental laws in the world. For example, in the Amazon region, the producers can use only 20% of the area. Of course, we have law enforcement problems. We are dealing with that. In the South, for example, the producers must preserve 20% of the area with native forests or reforestry. If you put together those 20%, we're going to have the size bigger than many countries, even in Europe. So it's important to tell that the importance of countries like Brazil, US, and Argentina helping to support the food supply for the planet. But again, with that in mind, sustainability, environmentally, socially, but also must be economically. Otherwise, prices of food are gonna go up, like we are seeing now because of those problems, pandemics and wars. So it's important to keep that in mind. Thank you for the opportunity, Mark.
No, thank you, Alexander. And let me say thank you to all our panelists and speakers, Mark Rossier, Shari, Fabio, Galina, Manuel, Herbert, and of course you, Alexander. It's been terrific to be with you. It's such an enriching discussion. I've done a terrible job as moderator. I know that. We're 5 minutes over. I could have continued at least for another half an hour, even an hour with all of you. It is a complex challenge that we face, for sure. It's systemic in nature. I think you referred to that, Shari, in your closing comment, and it does require all the actors to come together and to collaborate and not look at it from their own particular perspective in order to be able to solve it. So I hope I thanked all the speakers. If I didn't thank you, Galina, I thank you again. As always, a pleasure to be with you. But to all of you and to all of you in the audience, thank you. Sorry we didn't get to all the Q&As. We will respond to you. But for now, I will bring our event to a close and wish you a very good rest of the day and evening wherever you are. Thank you. Cheerio.